to the meeting with David Book to review the new Android core code. And this will be a very exciting presentation of a very major refresh of how our Android projects will work. With that, I'll turn it over to David.
Yeah, so thanks you guys for hanging out with us. This is always fun, and I'm trying to get better and better at running these webinars and keeping them focused on a topic so that we can get a little more use out of each one instead of kind of going really, really random. And so today, I've actually even prepared a simple little outline, which is unusual. So we're going to be talking about the new Android project. And for most everybody in this meeting, probably everybody in this meeting, this is something that we've been waiting for, and this is something that we've been kind of hopefully looking forward to. Being a programmer and being a creative person, you know, I've been a little anxious about this. I mean, anytime you make something entirely new or largely new, and you introduce it to a small audience or a large audience, you know, it's a little bit nerve-wracking. And so I'm prepared to you know, hear some feedback and some constructive criticism and all of that. And I expect you guys to be as excited as I am. And so let's talk about why all the changes to begin with, right? Why is it that we've had this kind of sort of big delay in a lot of other things around BuzzTouch while we waited for this? And so the biggest reason for the changes, the biggest reason, is the Android project that we were delivering through the downloads and the control panel and still are delivering as of today. They're dated, right? They're just dated. And they're not bad projects. They're on tens of thousands of you know, phones. They're actually millions of phones, but thousands and thousands of them exist, and they work pretty well, but they're a little old. And so we've known for quite some time that, wow, what are we going to do? We got to get our head around an Android refresh to support, in essence, tablets, Android 4.0, the new kind of paradigm that Google, the you know, kind of champion of all this stuff, embraces. And Google's telling us as developers, in a pretty fundamental way, hey, you shouldn't be developing this way, you should be developing this new way. And this new way came out quite a few months ago, and maybe even a year ago, depending on how in tune to all this stuff you are. And so some fundamental kind of shifts in the way that Google looked at this stuff and the way that Android operates, you know, is occurred, and our old project didn't keep up with that. And it kind of couldn't, because once you get something built and once you get something, you know, out there in the wild at scale, it's very, very challenging to just make a quick little change to it. And so what we found was lots of developers out there who were skilled and understood what the project was, they could make these changes and they could kind of evolve with the Android ecosystem, but the majority of our audience wasn't able to. And so our goal, one of our core goals at BuzzTouch, is when you make an app and you download your project, it should just work. And if you were to download an app today and put it on a new phone, an Android, you'd probably be a little bit disappointed, right? And so we're trying to get through that. The other thing that's really important about that goal of, you know, downloading it and having it just work is when things do change, we want you to be able to revisit your control panel, get the latest project, submit an update to the App Store, and not have to worry about that stuff. And so as we work towards that goal and kind of brag about, hey, if you have a BuzzTouch powered app and Android changes, you don't have to worry about it, we had to make this fundamental shift in the way that this thing works. So that was the reason for the delay in all these changes. The good news is I'm super stoked with the way that this thing works, this new core project. And going back to the creative kind of designer type, you know, we all of us are improving as we program, and all of us are learning better ways to do things all the time. And this project is much more efficient. It's much more efficient if you're a developer trying to do something. It's much more efficient on memory. In other words, Android likes it a little bit better. There's lots of things about it that just work better now that couldn't have been, these changes and improvements couldn't have been made without learning, you know, thousands and thousands of times what didn't work very well before. And so just like your projects change, so do ours, and I'm really, really stoked with kind of what we've been able to do with, in essence, a lot less code. So very excited about that. And then the last thing that I want to talk about in terms of why all the changes is this idea that we really are trying to think about the distinction between what is this BuzzTouch Core project, what is BuzzTouch Core, what does that mean, what's it all about, and the relationship it has with these plugins. And right now, it's a pretty blurry line. If you don't know how our system works, you might have a hard time understanding the difference. And so we've done a pretty poor job at communicating what the BuzzTouch Core project is and how these plugins kind of fit in it and magically make it better to people who aren't hyper interested like all of us are. We're all interested and we kind of get it, and we don't really need to do the same kind of communicating than we do with somebody who just doesn't understand Android. And so you're going to start to hear terms like BuzzTouch Core floating around in our community, hopefully on the site. And when you see the term and you hear us talking about it, and when you guys start to talk about it, the idea is to simplify the understanding of what we're doing. And so in essence, what we're doing is we're delivering a core project to people that's awesome, error-free, doesn't crash, it works great. When you introduce plugins to it, you've changed it, right? And so we want to separate what we do really, really well, which is manage and update and refresh this BuzzTouch Core, and what our developing community does with making these plugins. And that's kind of the goal with my line of thinking with this new project and soon to be the iOS 7 project. So let's go through the core and talk about what it is and what is included in this core as of right now, this meeting. Over the next few days, based on some of the things that you guys discover while you dig through this, we may include a few other little things, right? There's a lot of flexibility in this over the next few days before we start really sealing it up and saying, okay, this is what the download's going to be. And so all of you guys are going to get the opportunity to try to break it and try to think about how it's working and try to help us make improvements to it before we start dragging plugins into it. We don't want to confuse today's conversation with all these plugins. So the core itself has a couple of basic plugins in it that allow us to put it on phones and tap things and play with things and kind of discover how it's all put together without worrying about all these other external plugins. Because the thing that we don't want to run into is a million questions amongst ourselves that aren't related to this core project. Mm-hmm. And that'll be really easy to start happening. That'll start happening a lot if we're all working on different screens and different things. So we want to focus on this, getting it to run on some phones, playing with it, commenting on it, understanding it a little bit. And then we'll start saying, okay, this is how we drag these existing plugins into it. So that's the goal. So let's go ahead and get Eclipse in front of you guys. And you guys are familiar with the Eclipse environment. And I'm going to show you just basically...
Except for Kitsy.
Except for Kitsy, who's on Android Studio, I think. A couple of ideas. Before I get going too far along, I want to make sure everyone gets their hands on this project. There is a link in the chat window, in your GoToMeeting chat window at the very top, that is a download to the exact same thing that I have in front of me. I want you guys to get your hands on it and play with this thing, which is something that we've never done before.
Well, I don't think it's in the chat window unless you joined after you put it there.
Should I put it again?
So I think you have to put it again. I can't see it.
That's at the very, very top.
At the very, very top. You've got to scroll up.
Yep.
Yeah, no, it's not there for me, though. Remember, I joined a little later. I went back out before I joined, so if you join later, you can't see it.
I don't have it either.
And let me paste it in here then. That should work. Can you guys see that now? It's on a Dropbox. So the point is this is the exact same project that I'm working with right now on my computer. There's not one single thing different about it. We put it on that Dropbox literally 20 minutes before the meeting started. This is the first time that we've distributed, in essence, the core project to a lot of people in advance. So the reason that we did that is we wanted all of us to have the exact same thing, and we didn't want to be worried about package names, and we didn't want to be worried about the difference between your app and my app and Kitsy's app and all that. We're all working with the same thing. So you don't need to worry about, quote unquote, your app when you're looking at this. We just want you to run this thing the way it is and play with it the way it is so that we can explore. So in this project, when you get the download, I'm going to give you guys 30 seconds or so. There is a file along with the regular README. There's a README-dev file, README for developers. So go ahead and open that up. and kind of follow along with this conversation, because that's what I'm going to use to review this core. I'm going to go pretty fast because our outline said 20 minutes on this section, and I'm going to try to stick to that, but we can always come back to it. I'm just going to go through the overall concept. This is a technical conversation. It's completely okay if you don't understand some of the terms and some of the logic. That's fine. There are certainly some non-technical people in the meeting. That's completely okay. But that's why I wrote this document, so you can go back and revisit this while you kind of hack around and dig around. And so I put that right at the top. This document is intended for developers. And so it's an effort on my part to explain to you in the simplest terms possible, how's this thing work? Right? And this is kind of a first time that I've actually tried to write almost like an editorial on how it works. It's not a tutorial. It's not a technical, reference document. It's just kind of my thinking on how this thing works so that you guys can maybe get your head around it a little bit differently than before. A lot of it's the same, of course, but I've never done this before. So basically, it's saying here, what we got there? We got an echo.
README dev file.
Yep.
Thanks.
Didn't hear you, sorry. So basically it's telling you that the Android core is a collection of Java class files, XML layout files, and other resources, such as the Android manifest, that are compiled using the Android SDK. The compiling process is what turns all of these files into an app. Right? This is an important concept. Our control panel doesn't deliver apps. It delivers projects. You guys turn them into apps when you compile them. And so we get loose with these terms and we call it app making and app building and all that kind of stuff, but that's an important distinction. So the core project is something that we give to you so that you can then make an app out of it. And the idea is the core has lots of different files that do lots of different things to make it much easier for you. Flexible, efficient, you want to do apps in volume, that kind of stuff. So that's in essence what the core is. And if we explore these files, they look lots like the other older Android project that we've all seen. And they all work together to kind of do something. So that's the goal. I think most of us understand that. But there's a big distinction now compared to before in that if you compiled the core with no plugins in it, just the way it comes out of your control panel, if you didn't include any plugin, it'll work. It won't crash. Before, you had to have that next level of understanding, or you had all kinds of trouble. So this thing standalone actually does something. It doesn't do much, but it's designed to give you a better understanding of what's going on should you be interested. So I've written down here how it works, basically. First, I'm going to show you it working on my simulator. This is a Nexus 7 simulator, a tablet, and it's in landscape mode right now. And you'll notice that it looks like this application that's running, which is the BuzzTouch core app that you all have, is a pretty generic but pretty standardized Android app. It's got an action bar, it's got a few tabs, it's got a clickable home, menu button on the left for the apps icon. It's got a menu on the action button on the right. These are all things that the other project never had. And these are things that nearly every Android app has now. So this is our attempt at sticking with standards and moving into the future about, hey, when you want to make an Android app, it ought to be kind of like this. Now the colors might be different, of course, and the style might be different, but the concrete structure of it's going to be the same. So you'll notice there's no hardware key back button on this modern device, right? I've got a software key for back, and there's no keyboard, all these different things. So in essence, what we have here is a menu. We're all familiar with a menu. And we have these three tabs are connected to a plugin. This one's connected to the very same plugin, but it looks a little different. This one's connected to the very same plugin, but it looks a little different. This will make more sense here in a minute. We have a menu button on the right that might have no items in it, or it might have lots of items in it, which is a new thing in terms of our approach. You can now customize the menu very easily.
Nice.
Yeah, so this is all the same plugin doing different things. On this instance, it's got a button on it. On this instance, it has a button that loads a different screen. It's just a series of navigational elements all using the same plugin, which if we've done this before, we kind of understand what that means, but if you've never done this before, it'll make more sense as we follow along. So this is what the project looks like. When you're on the home screen, which you can now get to from anywhere in your app, from any tab or any screen, tapping the applications icon, which will be your icon for your app. We then have the typical classic, BuzzTouch-esque refresh data, link, which is fine. It's going to load the data. So this is our, loading look, and then it's going to reload the app. And so in essence, this thing does everything we need it to do to support whatever screens and elements we're going to add to it. I want to show you this in the simulator first before we talked about it, and then we'll kind of jump back and forth a little bit. So the first thing we're going to go to is back to our README dev text file, and it's saying how this works basically. And this is a technical description, step by step, of what's happening in the project from the time it launches to the time it basically stops doing anything until people interact with it. So that's an important concept. When the app launches, this is the home screen, right? So I've arrived at this point. I'm not tapping anything. I'm not swiping anything. There's no user interaction right now. So in essence, the app's doing nothing. It's just waiting for me. One of the common problems that we have is, and the questions I get all the time, is related to, how does it work? And they, developers and people in our community, don't even really understand how it launches, loads, figures out the home screen, and then lands somewhere and just kind of stops and sits there. And so I've outlined that process from launch to here, nobody tapping, nobody interacting, in the step-by-step. And so that process is exactly what happens every time somebody uses the refresh data choice. So refresh data does the same thing that launching it does. It just restarts this process to kind of start over. And we all know that. So let's visit that real quick. What does start over mean, or what does launch mean? So step one here, user taps the icon on the device. Pretty generic. So what happens at that point? A lot of people don't understand this stuff. So we're going to go through 1 to 9 to arrive at that home screen waiting for interaction. So number 1 is the user taps the icon. There's no explanation necessary. Everybody knows what that means. Number 2 is Android, the operating system, looks at the manifest for that app that you tap the icon for. So the Android manifest is reviewed real quickly, and it tries to figure out what is the home screen or the first screen. Technically it's called an activity. What is the first activity that this app should display? That's what happens. That's the first thing that happens in Android's world. So let's look at that config, the manifest, and I'll show you where it does that. So the details about this manifest right now aren't important, but what is important is this section right here. If you've done any Android development at all, you recognize right away what this is. And this is our activity entry for the launcher activity, or the main activity. It's also the only activity listed in this manifest, which might surprise some of you. In the older Android projects, you had to list all of the activities before you could use them, which was a significant challenge for our downloading engine and our process, because everybody's manifests look different, right? There was this whole weird, like my manifest might have 30 activities or plugins in it, and yours might have 10. Mm-hmm. So the great news is you don't have to do that anymore with these BuzzTouch projects.
Awesome.
And the reason that you don't have to do that anymore is not because Android suddenly lets you launch activities without listing them. The reason is we're not going to launch any more activities. Period. This project has one activity, end of story. So we don't have to worry about that anymore. So there's a new concept called an Android fragment that you can load and unload and all that kind of stuff. And all the plugins are now going to be based on fragments. So we don't have to list them in the manifest, which is awesome. But we do have to list the only activity that we use, and it's the first activity and the one that we launch from the beginning. And it is called BuzzTouch Activity Host, BT Activity Host. And it's the only activity in the project that we use, and it is right here. I'm not going to go through it in crazy detail right now, but what this is in essence, kind of the parent host or container for everything that goes on in our app. And fundamentally, what's happening when we're running the app on the phone or the device is this is the host activity running. And each of the screens or plugins is a different fragment that we're loading into the activity or unloading. So we load a fragment and then unload a fragment, load a fragment and then unload a fragment. And so that is fabulously flexible compared to before and far more efficient. And we should probably do a whole conversation about why fragments are awesome as compared to activities, but it's kind of beyond the scope of this talk. But just know that making a fragment is certainly easier than making an activity, and it's 1,000 times more flexible. It's 1,000 times more flexible. So I'm really happy that Android did that to us. It's been a bit of a pain and forced us down a path that we didn't really want to go down, but now that I've gone down it, it's like, woohoo! It's the greatest thing ever. So super stoked about that. So back to our instructions. That was instruction number 2. Android read the manifest, launched the activity. The home screen, or the first activity in every Android project, is the starting place. So in our case, we all know that our home screen plugin is different in all of our apps. We all know that. So how in the world will we know what to show first? Right? That's challenging. So clearly we have to have a method to try to figure that out. And so this is just some discussion about what we just talked about. But this is the important part right here. Step number 4. Tap the icon, step number 1. Activity host load, step number 2. 3 is basically an explanation of finding the home screen, activity host. And 4 is telling us that BuzzTouch activity host, the activity, is going to load the first fragment all the time for all of us. It will be the same fragment. And it's called fragment load config data. So when we go back to this simulator, I already described that clicking refresh resets the process. This is just going to take a sec, but when you see the loading message, this is that fragment I'm talking about. I think in the community we're going to end up calling it like the loading fragment or something like that. Depending on how your app works, you might not even see it. It might just be instantly gone. There's a lot of variables like, are you downloading the config from the internet? It's just like the refresh process today that we're all used to. But the key here is, and this is really why it's so flexible now and simple, is it's the first fragment that we're showing on the screen. It just so happens to not just be a loading message. It's not a splash screen. There's a little bit of a difference, and we'll maybe get to that today, maybe not, but it's just the first fragment that we load. When it's done loading the data, it's this fragment's job to tell the activity, the host activity that's always running, what is the first screen for this app? Does it have tabs? Is it a quiz on the home screen? What is it? Is it a list? Is it a button? What the heck is the first screen? So that's the whole reason this load activity, this fragment loader exists, is to figure that out. Obviously, you should explore this, at will, or in as much detail as you want, and you'll see lots of the same concepts and lots of the same code from the past. We had a kind of a landing activity before the app would launch, and there was like this weird activity that would show loading and then disappear. It was just very strange. So that's all gone. So after it reads the data, and it says here in step 5, this is an Android fragment that serves as a loading point or a landing point, and its primary purpose is to read the configuration file, our buzztouch.txt file. That's what that thing exists for. And so it's going to read the file in the project or get it from the internet or wherever it gets it, and then it's going to move forward and it's going to tell the host what is the home screen. And so in step 6 here, we got a little explanation about the BuzzTouch config.txt, what it is. We'll get back to that a little bit here too. And then in step 7, it's saying, hey, the loader fragment has read all the configuration data, and it says this is how the layout should be set up. So at that point, it now communicates with the activity. And this is an important concept. All of our plugins now have the ability to communicate with this hosting activity. So if there's a method in the hosting activity called report to cloud, well then any of our fragments can say, hey activity, go report to cloud. Or maybe there's a method called show alert or show progress or download image or whatever. All of our fragments can now communicate with this activity. So it's going to tell the activity after it's done loading, hey activity, why don't you go ahead and configure your environment? So configure your environment is a method that I wrote that starts off the process of what happens when this app first launches. Does it register for push? Does it prompt for location? What does it do? So that's this configure environment method runs, and it's in the activity host. So we could find that method very easily, and I encourage you to do that. So this is the configure environment method, and it's triggered by that fragment. It's the fragment talking to it saying, hey, go do this, I'm done loading now. So that's cool. After it configures the environment, which is mostly a non-visible process, it's a real quick kind of a setup phase for the app to understand kind of what's coming. What's the environment, what's going on with this thing? Does it use a data URL? Does it turn the GPS on? Does it track shaking movements? What are these things that it does? Does it prompt for push? It's all these simple yes/no questions. And then as soon as that happens, the last thing that it does is to run another method called setup tabs. And setup tabs is what actually lays out the interface. So the interface here, in this case, is tabs and a menu as the home screen menu on tab, the home screen for tab 1. In another case, it might not be tabs. In another case, it might be totally different, but the method is still called setup tabs. And we might just discover that there are 0 tabs, which is fine. So in essence, that's it. So let's review that. And I put this in here. At this point, no user interaction has occurred, and the app is displaying its home screen. So to recap that, this is what happened so far. The activity host launched. The fragment to load the data ran. It read the configuration file. It asked the host to configure the environment after learning about the app from the config file. And then it set up tabs. That's it. There's like 5 things that happen. Now clearly, if you were to just look at each of those methods, which I encourage you to do, you'll find that it's quite a bit more sophisticated than that, kind of as you peel back the layers. But in essence, it's 5 things. And so when someone's trying to sleuth out, what happens when I launch my app, this should help you kind of understand that. So that's the goal there. So at this point, what happens? What the heck happens when I tap a button? What happens when I, I don't know, rotate the device? So it's also kind of, in my mind, equally as simple, but may not be so simple with you. I understand that. So on number 10 here, if you want to explore this question further, how does a BuzzTouch app run? We just talked about what it takes to get it running, right? The steps to kind of just get it running. And number 10 is user interaction. And it says the app relies on user interaction from this point forward. Tapping a button or a tab or a menu item instructs the BuzzTouch core to load a specific screen. Each screen that loads is an instance of a BuzzTouch plugin or a custom class that you make or whatever. So loading screens, technically speaking, is a 2-step process. Somebody taps a button and we got to figure out what to show. So we have to find the ID of the screen to load. And the ID, of course, is in our config file, which I closed. So if I tap, this tab, I need to find the ID for the screen. Item ID, item ID, item ID. So step 1, every single time you want to load a screen, is which screen? Got to find it in this config that's in memory because we read it first. So step 1 when loading fragments is find the ID of the thing you want to load. And then step 2 is pass this screen's item ID to another little method to load the screen. So we have a method called load screen with item ID. We have a method called load screen with nickname. There's all these little helper methods that are actually pretty simple to use once you get your head around it, and far less simpler than the first Android project. So, and we'll hopefully explore that. So number 10 is just an explanation of what happens when you tap something. That's all that is. And then number 11, loading BuzzTouch plugins, is kind of an extension of number 10, right? So it says BuzzTouch plugins, which are not part of the core, are Java class files that extend the BuzzTouch fragment class. The third part of our conversation is going to be about making a plugin. So plugins extend the BuzzTouch fragment class, and this has some useful methods and properties that make it easier for us to take advantage of the core offer, right? What is in the core? And so there's a note here that says open up the sample plugin, which is included in our core now. We have a sample plugin that kind of shows you how to do a few things. And it just says explore that sample plugin and try to kind of understand what's going on. It's a simple file, although you could make a even simpler file, which I'll show you. It just won't do anything, right? So to make a plugin that does something, there's some kind of basic requirements, and I'll show you those in the sample. And that's it. So there's some other notes in here that talk about using methods in the fragment and in the host. How do I use these methods? You know, how do I show progress and show alert and download data? So there's some conversation in here about how to do that. There's some conversation in here about the difference between a method that's in a what we call a static method and a static class and a non-static class. Some people don't understand that, so there's some talk about that. And then there's some talk about some of the methods that you'll run into in this project that are unimplemented. Unimplemented. What that means is, oftentimes you'll hear a method stub. I'll give you a perfect example. Perfect example. This is a class called BuzzTouch Database. You've never seen a class called BuzzTouch Database before in any of the other projects. And if you're like me, you probably are going, wow, I can't imagine what that's going to do. That's awesome, right? Because you can imagine what I'm thinking when I introduce a class called BuzzTouch Database where it says save item to database, get item from database, sync items with database, right? You can read these method names and get a clue as to what they're going to do. But you can also see that they're empty methods. So these unimplemented methods, there's quite a few of them in this project already. Not all of them will ever be implemented. The idea is because things move so quick, we kind of explore with these methods and we can add them and remove them, and it's pretty exciting stuff. And so there's a lot of things that this project does that the other one didn't, that it does right now, which is awesome. And then there's a lot of stuff that I kind of dream about. And I put it in here and I take it out and I put it back, and then it kind of gets legs and it's like, yeah, let's do that, right? And so the database class, I've got a working one. I'm intentionally not leaving in what you guys have because, again, I don't want to distract everybody. I want to make sure this core works the way it's supposed to work before I start getting, you know, how do I write a select query on an SQL like that? It's like, dude, really? Let's just stay on this and focus on getting the core understood before we start progressing. But I did leave a little note in the readme.dev or -dev about unimplemented methods because I didn't want you to worry that you found something broken or whatever. I know every method in this project intimately. There's no surprises that you can tell me. Now there are things that you might break, which I definitely want to know about, and Susan and the and the whole gang, we need to know this stuff. But in terms of like, hey, did you know this was in there? Yeah, I know it's in there. So that's kind of the explanation. The explanation. So I'm going to go back to our outline. It took a little bit longer than 20 minutes, like I said, and we're going to pause before we extend the fragment. We do have a big long time slot for our meeting. So let's take a couple of questions. I've not been using the questions. How does this new concept relate to the app delegate? Great question. Let's go back to our project. The short answer is the app delegate today is used the same way that it was used before. And the app delegate is a place where we can hold values kind of globally. It's the place where we can put properties and options and things in our app used throughout. And so I said that the Android activity Host was the first screen that launched, and it was the starting point for Android, which is true as it relates to the interface. But technically speaking, in an effort to try to keep this easier to understand, I kind of passed over this app delegate idea. So the app delegate is actually the main launching point for this Java program. And you'll notice that in the app delegate, it extends application. So that the code that extends application in your project, there's only one of them, is what kind of launches it all. And so this is not related to the interface. You can't see anything in this class. But to answer Chris's question, how does it affect this? All of this stuff, all these variables in this app delegate, just like your delegate now, are available globally throughout the app. So we have a lot of values in here that we'll use on other screens that developers might want to use, things like that. And so it's still the launching point or the main if you've studied Java. But it doesn't do anything. It doesn't show an interface or anything like that. Android goes right to the manifest to figure out what shows on the screen first. So basically, it just instantiates this, goes right to the first activity, and that is a requirement. You can't run an activity without an Android application running, and this is what gets our Android application running because it extends the application class. So great question. Let's look through here a couple more. Did the bug with the fragments get resolved with Jake? Absolutely. You've probably heard of a million of my bug complaints. I was having a heck of a time, just to put some context around this, I was having a heck of a time with a lot of these fragment concepts as it related to getting them going the way that I wanted to get them going, kind of based on the past, right? I couldn't get my head around making these big dramatic changes and taking all of everybody's work and saying, you know what, that's junk. No more plugins. That just wasn't going to work for me. So we needed to figure out a way to move into this project without breaking everything and without making it completely impossible to move forward. And so we all know that the plugins are challenging to change, but they're not that bad. And so I got through some stuff that I was venting about to Jake, who's a confidant and a great guy, and I was frustrated, and I appreciate that question because I'm relieved to say that I'm not worried about fragments anymore. But 2 or 3 weeks ago, I was banging my head against the wall, super angry. So that's Jake's. And then LA's saying, when can we start downloading the core and test? Right now. Hopefully you already have it. The goal is take this core, compile it, run it on a phone. I'm going to show you how to change it up a little bit here in a minute. And just ignore all the plugins that you're so used to for now. Just ignore them. Only worry about how this core works and seeing what you can change about how your app works with what you have. And you'll be surprised at how, in essence, kind of simple it is. It's kind of elegantly simple. And so, great question. I don't see any more. Let's move on with that idea. How can I extend this app without making a new plugin? Let's just say it that way first. So let's explore one of the plugins that are in here. Let's explore the plugin sample. Hey, what do you know? Super easy. So the plugin sample is in essence the only plugin in this app aside from that menu list that I put in there. I put the menu list in there so that we can at least have some navigation going on and see, move around from screens to screen. So we have 2 plugins technically included in this core. The menu list, the simplest one I could make, and the sample plugin. The purpose of the sample plugin is to show you how simple it is really to make a plugin. So it doesn't extend BuzzTouch activity like the olden days. It extends BuzzTouch fragment. Everything about the way this thing works, technically speaking, is different than an activity. But on the screen and in code and to developers, it's nearly the same. There's a life cycle, the onCreate and the onDestroy, all that's the same. We can do exactly the same thing in a fragment as we could in an activity. And so I just want to point out that the difference is it extends BuzzTouch fragment instead of BuzzTouch activity. We have onAttach, we have onCreate, we have the Android lifecycle stuff, just like we've always had, just generic stuff. And the meat and potatoes happens in onCreate_View. onCreate_View is different than onCreate. And in our existing plugins that you guys are all used to seeing, the meat and potatoes of what goes on happens in onCreate. As soon as you instantiate an activity, onCreate runs, and all of our code kind of goes to work. A fragment's different. We don't necessarily want all of our code to go to work until we're ready to see the fragment. If we're not ready to see the fragment, there's no sense in going through this big time-consuming process of building layouts and inflating XML files and downloading data from the internet and all this other stuff. We only want to do that when the fragment's, quote unquote, about to be displayed. So it's this onCreate view event that we do that in. So in our simple little plugin, let's go to the configuration data. I have 3 versions of this right here. I have sample plugin 1, sample plugin 2, sample plugin 3. They all use the same class file. It's one plugin, one Java file. So just like you might have 5 maps that have different locations, or you might have 5 menus that have different items, we have 3 versions of the sample plugin. In our simulator, if we run sample plugin number 1, we get the screen. It looks like this. It has some text on it, and it has a button. If we run sample plugin number 2, it has some more text on it and a button. If we run sample number 3, and so on and so forth. So it's this. I'm just changing what happens with the plugin to demonstrate that it's dynamic. So this one has a button right here, which loads another screen. This one has a button, which loads another menu. This one has a menu. That one doesn't have a menu. I think screen 2 has the menu. This one's hooked to a dynamic menu that takes me anywhere else. It's just the flexibility we're trying to demonstrate. So in screen 1, you can see I've got a background color, just like we're all so used to. I've got dynamic text. This is dynamic text on screen 1. I've got a dynamic button text. This is button on screen 1. I've connected the button to another screen. Super simple. Super simple. And I've done this a little bit differently in all 3 of these instances. And we already know some of the other properties that are available in any other BuzzTouch plugin. Require login, all these kinds of basic things. Totally still all available. Background color, background image, it's all the same as it used to be. None of that changed. So if I went to Google and steal a background image real quick, we'll go to images. Let's find a background image of a boat, because I'm a boat guy. We'll do this one. It's probably tiny and small and ugly, but we'll get it anyway. That's huge. I don't want a huge one. We'll get a little one. If I get this boat image, and instead of doing background color on screen 1, if I do, what is it, background image URL large device, I think, because this is a tablet, just as an example. So I'm just demonstrating to you that all the properties, in fact, all of the properties, still exist. Totally fine. It just so happens that my sample plugins introduced a few new ones for the sample. Dynamic text, and that's only related to that one plugin. So that's kind of cool. So we put, did this already launch? We put that background picture on this screen, and it works just like before. Just like before, with one giant difference. And this is a fantastic difference. Yay! If we look at the code for this plugin, remember we're in plugin sample. You close all this other stuff. That's the whole onCreate view. There is no configure navbar, configure background, all kinds of code that we all had to put in all of our plugins no longer needs to be in the plugins. Because the navbar and the background and the menu and all of this stuff is in the activity now. That's the same activity for everything. So you're just changing the fragment. You may or may not want to switch the background image. If you do, It's easy. But generally, it's in the config data already, and we don't have to worry about it. Much, much better. Much, much better. And so it's just an example of plugins becoming more flexible. We don't have to worry about a lot of stuff. You might ask, well, where does the background image get updated? What's doing that? Well, if you really dug in, and if you really paid really close attention, you would notice that tapping the tab, that's what's changing the title. That's what's setting the background. It's happening before your fragment even loads. It already knows the title, and it already knows the background, and it already knows how to do that before your fragment's even done loading. Because it's not part of your fragment anymore. It's part of the core. And so that doesn't mean that your fragment can't change the title, and that doesn't mean that your fragment can't change the background. It just means that you don't have to worry about it anymore. Super cool. Super cool. So going back, this is our image. You notice it's crazy fast. I could change full screen, all that just like before. I'm not going to do it. I just want to demonstrate to you that they're still the same idea. So let's go to, let's just for fun, let's make this not a tabbed app. Right? If the tabs array didn't exist, and you guys know my famous trick of just introducing a typo, the tabs array is not in this project now. It's not in this project. So the first screen is going to be the menu, and it's not going to be tabbed. It's just going to be an app without tabs, which is fine. We're all used to that. We've all seen lots of that stuff. It's completely okay. You can still navigate around. You still have an action bar. You still have the little action bar menu. All that stuff is still the same. You just don't have any tabs. Awesome. You still have the menu, though, which is significant. It's a lot of flexibility. You still have the back button, right? Super easy and fast. So that's cool. Let me put our tabs back. And let's look at that plugin, because that takes us to the next part of our conversation, which is extending the fragment. Spend a little bit of time on this. I'm going to take all of this code in this fragment. I'm going to paste it in a blank file over here so we can put it back in just a second. And I'm going to get rid of a bunch of stuff. I'm going to get rid of a bunch of stuff. I'm going to get rid of, in essence, everything. And I'm doing this on purpose. This is our sample fragment. Our sample plugin. And that is all it does. Nothing. It's a simple class file that extends the fragment. That's all it does. And I want to show you that it will load. And it won't crash. It doesn't do anything. It will be blank, but it will not crash. And I'll show you why. Which a lot of you will be like, what are you talking about? How can that work? And again, the focus is on giving you something literally this simple to then build on. It doesn't have to be more complex than some of the things we've introduced to you in the past. It's like, look, this is all that's needed to make an Android class. Why does it crash? Well, it doesn't. So let's run it now with nothing. It's still a class file. You can still instantiate an instance of it. It just doesn't do anything, which is great. So this is our sample plugin. So when we go to our simulator, this is the menu. When we load our sample plugin, it's just blank. But notice the background color. And notice the background image. Oh, I took the background image out. But my point is it's not crashing. And we're loading that sample plugin because it exists. We don't need anything else. But obviously, we want to put other stuff in our plugins. So how do we do that? I'm going to pause for a sec. Does anybody know why this thing's not crashing? How can that possibly work? Anybody want to take a stab at that? Go ahead, Chris.
Because the activity is still running with all of its code. This is just adding on top of the activity.
Okay, that's a good start. Not exactly what I was looking for, but this is not an activity.
Right. Yeah. I meant the main activity that loads the fragment.
So is this fragment loading?
Technically, I maybe.
It's interesting, right? What I expected you to say was, well, because this fragment extends the BuzzTouch fragment, it's already doing everything it needs to do. There's a lot of methods in the BuzzTouch fragment that are happening that we don't even need to know about as developers. So that's kind of what I was looking for, although you're exactly right. When you say load fragment, you do have to give Android a fragment. You can't load nothing. You do have to give it a fragment, and we're giving it a fragment with no view. So let's give it a view. Let's just take the next step and give it a view. So the next step is, I'm going to go back to the thing that I copy and pasted here. I'm only going to add one method called onCreateView, and Android determines, how these methods work. I'm going to get rid of this, just for fun. And I'm going to return to Android when it asks for a view. When it asks this plugin or this plugin, it asks this fragment for a view, I'm going to give it a view, and I'm going to give it an XML file called BT plugin sample. That's it. I'm not going to do anything to that XML file. I'm not going to manipulate it dynamically or anything. I'm just going to say, here's your view. And that, again, will work. And what we're going to get is a button on the screen with no text on it, because the XML doesn't define the text of the button. And we're going to get a label with no text in it. So it's going to be nearly blank, but it will be there. is the important part. And so that's pretty cool stuff. So this plugin now has a button that doesn't do anything. It's full width and it's positioned the way it's positioned because the layout that we used, plugin sample, remember most all plugins have a XML layout and a Java file, so the sample layout that we used has a button. It just doesn't have any text on it. We could easily put some text in here. What is this, text? But that's no fun, right? It's way better to do it dynamically. But you could, and we're just asking it for a layout. It's no big deal. So, and here's our label with no text, our text view. But we gave it this file, and we said, use that as your view. And then we got a little fancy, and we said, wait a minute, we're developers here. Let's find the text field, text view in that layout, and let's give it some text. So let's get a reference to the text view. In other words, point to it in our layout. Then let's read the JSON data in our configuration file and find the text that should go in there. Remember, dynamic text. Let's find the text, and then let's stick it in that text view. That's what this is doing. So we're doing the exact same thing that we did before in all the other plugins. We're just doing it with a whole lot less code. And we're doing it in the onCreate view. We're not doing it in the onCreate. That's all. And so super, super simple. Not a big deal. Let's load this. That's screen number 2. Right? Button has no text. Button doesn't do anything, but we do have our dynamic text that we pulled out of the JSON. So let's continue that and put it back the way we were. Let's get a reference to the button. Let's get the text for the button. If we find some text for the button, let's go ahead and stick it on the button. Let's look for an item, a screen to load when someone taps the button. If we find one of those, go ahead and ask the parent activity to load the screen with item ID, which is what switches the fragment. We don't have to know all that stuff. That's all this plugin does. And so this kind of demonstrates the same types of things that the previous project demonstrated, but hopefully a much simpler approach. So what I've been working on along with this, and what Sue's been working on, a lot of people have been working on really, is converting our plugins to fragments and not activities. And I know that that's the focus and that's completely okay, but it is important that before we jump to that and start worrying about what's wrong with individual plugins, that we understand and honestly try to break this thing just by messing with the config data as it is. Right? No data URL, because then everybody's going to get confused about what config file they're looking at. All these concepts that just frankly aren't related yet to how this thing works. And so this is our group. This is our attempt, really the first attempt that we're making to really try to get, some heads around this thing outside of our tiny little core leader group. I want developers out there and people who want to tinker with it to have a chance to understand it without all the complexity of everybody else's stuff, which is the plugins and which is all that. And so this project is exactly that. It's your opportunity to have kind of the raw BuzzTouch core before anybody else, so that you can kind of see what we're thinking. And so I don't expect it to change much before it lands on the download page. I don't expect it to change much, but I do expect it to change some. And so fundamentally, there's just no way it's going to change a lot. I mean, I've worked my tail off on this thing for a very long time, and it's unimaginable to, like, a week from now say, well, you know what, scrap that, let's do something else. What I'm talking about is maybe there's a typo, maybe there's something, maybe one of you guys puts it on some device that it won't run on, and we didn't know that. I've tested this thing on Android 3.0. Well, look at my, just today and last night, you can look at my Android Virtual Device Manager. I got 3.0, 4.0, 4.1.2, 4.2.2. It does manifest itself a little bit differently in each phone, each device. In fact, this is an important topic. One of the things that we used to do that felt like the right thing to do when we decided to do it was make the app look and feel the same in every phone. That was the original goal of our Android core project, was put this on a phone and it will work and it'll look like this. The problem is that's not a realistic goal anymore. And it's also bad practice. Your app should run on a native device like the other apps run on that device. It shouldn't have funky tab bars if nothing else does. It shouldn't have an action bar menu button if it's got a hardware button, right? It shouldn't do this. And so your app, the BuzzTouch Core app, does a very, very kind of amazing job, and that's thanks to Google, and thanks to sticking to some standards that we didn't really stick to before because they didn't exist, of just kind of working. It's awesome. And so I'll give you some examples. If you run this on a 3.0 device, it'll be a little bit different. You won't have the right side navigation button up here, right? You'll have notice there's no menu button on this device. You'll have a hardware menu button. It will do the same thing. It'll open a menu, but you won't have this look here. Interesting little differences like that. Notice how the tabs are to the right of the title on a tablet? That's standard Android stuff. If we let me take one more shot at this just to demonstrate what I mean. Let's put a right side nav button on our home screen menu. Right side nav button. I can't remember if this is right. Anybody know if I got my typos right? Right side button type, right side nav button type. I can't remember. Anybody remember? Oh well. Let me look at my view utilities. I'll find it. Can't remember what the property name is. Here we go. Nav bar right button type. And I do know that info light works. But I wanted to demonstrate to you what it looks like on this device, because this is part of the conversation here. Because it will be a little bit different on some of the other devices. Not much, but a little bit. And that's okay. Because that's what Android's all about, right? Is that flexibility. Here I got my Which screen did I put this on? Oh, I probably need a load item ID. I don't want to get off on a tangent. You guys can experiment with that. But the point is, sometimes the tabs will be under the title. Sometimes the tabs will scroll horizontally if there's a lot of them. Sometimes the tabs will shrink up and drop vertically if there's a lot of them and it's on a tiny device. There's all these interesting things that Android users are now used to. And so that's the concept now. It's not trying to force your app to look the same on every device. It's trying to force your app to be standards compliant and flexible and perform well and not surprise people and be weird like no one else's. Right? You want to fit in the ecosystem appropriately. You don't want to force your way into the ecosystem by saying tabs should be like this. And in the early days, that just wasn't a concept. And we were all kind of up in the air with trying to explore Android. And now that Google has really taken a firm stand on how things ought to be, I think we'll all agree that they're doing quite well, right? They've published some standards. They've led us in developer conferences. They've delivered some hardware. They keep delivering on an operating system every 8 months when the competitors are slowing down, right? They're kicking some butt right now. And so we need to embrace those things as app developers, which does not mean there's not room for creativity. There's way more room for creativity than there ever has been. That's not the point. The point is, just because it looks different on one device than another device does not mean that it's not working well. And so it'll be interesting to see how many devices we get this on in the next few days or weeks or whatever, and how it does. So Android 3.0 or above. 3.0 or above. I've compiled it on the very latest thing, and 3.0, which is actually like a year old now, or 2 years old. No problems. No problems. No crashing. No memory management problems. There was a couple of simulators where I couldn't download successfully big, giant, heavy billboard-sized background art, like huge, 10 megabyte or 50 megabyte or whatever, pictures of golf courses and sailboats and all my favorite stuff. But it didn't crash. It used to crash. Now you look in the console and it just says, "Dude, I'm out of memory. I can't do this." And so on some of these older devices, which is great. So Susan's saying, will you type your questions in the chat bar? Okay, cool. Jake's saying,
my thought was that we could pick out a couple of questions for the recording that seem to reflect the bigger picture, and then maybe turn off the recording and just kind of chat some more.
Yeah, that's fine. So let's wrap this up then. Let me just make a couple closing remarks. To summarize, we talked about why we did this, and it was so that you have better apps. We talked about what's different in this project compared to the existing Android project, and really what it boils down to is we're not loading multiple activities. We're loading instances of fragments. That's the fundamental difference, along with some neat features that we didn't even really get into today. The third thing that we talked about was what the heck is a fragment and a plugin, and I just kind of demonstrated to you that you can make a plugin. Plugins are not complicated with PHP and backend. That's a whole separate thing. Make a plugin and just make a class file, give it a name, and see if you can load it. That's kind of the idea. Play with that idea. And then the last thing that we did is we explored a little bit of why we don't want to worry about our app looking a little different in different types of devices, because that's the way it's supposed to be. And with that, there's a tons of conversation I'm sure you guys are interested in having. I'm actually gonna ask Sue to close us up and end the recording, and then we'll just stick around as needed.
Sure. Okay. Well, end the recording. Thank you, David.